Good morning to all of my YouTube followers. So glad to see everybody here on this amazing July 11th. Today is Thursday, July 11th. It's my 40th YouTube Live. It's been a while. I had to finish some work, and now that the work is finished, glad to be back on YouTube. Over the past 2 weeks, I had the amazing pleasure of being able to present a paper at the 2024 Summer Symposium organized by Dr. Carolyn Denard, and the Toni Morrison Society. That was an incredible experience in Fort-de-France, Martinique. I really wanted to present Morrison's homage to the Caribbean. I consider her fourth novel an homage to the Caribbean, um, Tar Baby, and I didn't get it when I first read it. I first read it in my 20s, totally lost about what she was trying to do, and then after I read Tar Baby, I read The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, Paul Marshall's second novel. And that was written before Tar Baby. And reading that novel allowed me to understand the respect Morrison had for maroon culture, Caribbean maroon culture in the Caribbean. And that shows up in the novel Tar Baby. So in my paper, um, and I was presenting with an amazing panel. Um, Judy Lynn Ryan from Ohio Wesleyan University, Professor Emerita, Dr. Carol Boyce Davies, author of uh, Left of Karl Marx, the biography she wrote of Claudia Jones. And I was on the panel with a professor from Martinique, Malik Noel Ferdinand, who did an incredible paper about Césaire, Carrière d'un pays natal, Return to My Native Land, Aimé Césaire. So the whole point of the symposium was to look at commonalities between the work of Toni Morrison and the work of the Martinican writer Aimé Césaire. And so I got to present this paper comparing Morrison's fourth novel, Tar Baby, with Aimé Césaire's 1966 stage play, A Season in the Congo. And I saw a 2013 production of that done about 11 years ago, directed by Rico Spade. So that is what I compared to Tar Baby. And if you've ever read these works or seen the performance, you'll understand that it's basically the theme of both works that I looked at in my paper is that theme of betrayal, the romance in Tar Baby between Sun Green and Jadine Childs, why it falls apart. And I talk about the relationship, not a romance, but the relationship between Césaire's Mokutu, who is based on the real life Joseph Mobutu, and that relationship between Mobutu and Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese revolutionary, is what Césaire is looking at. In my paper, I talk about, both betrayal and the process of being betrayed by one who was colonized more um, because of Western colonization. In the case of Tar Baby, I talk about how Jadine was so focused on her individual career. She enjoyed the romance with Sun, but when it came to the part of respecting his American South culture, Sun Green was born and raised in North. Morrison's Sun Green character was born and raised in Elo, Florida. She said North Florida in the novel. And so in their romance, they meet in this Caribbean island. They enjoy a romance in New York. Then when they travel from New York to Sun Green's hometown, that's when the tempers flare. And um, ultimately, she does not respect Sun's American South culture. And so what Morrison shows as a result of that relationship falls apart. But as with any important Morrison novel, you have to pay close attention to how it falls apart because there's a powerful lesson. One of the things my dad taught me about Morrison's work is you'll find the lesson in the puzzle. All of her novels are puzzles that are out of order, and it's up to the reader to put the events in order to get the lesson, in order to get the lesson. And A Season in the Congo, wow, what a harrowing play. It's really meant to shock you the way that Mokutu just takes over and nobody seems to be able to stop him. So Césaire is really shaking the audience up like, be aware of these Mokutus. And really, what Mokutu has done, or Mobutu, on which Cesar's Mokutu is based, is really teach us about the danger of the neo-colonists, because all the exploitation we see in the nation of Congo today, particularly the coltan that's being used for our smartphones, that you're able to coltan through which you see me, is all because of that betrayal. So that's what I looked at in this paper, just that theme of betrayal in a season in the Congo. And of course, it was an incredible time and incredible experience to hear the keynote address by Edwidge Danticat, pictured with me here. Very moved by her works, particularly The Farming of Bones. Very powerful writer. I told her she has a short story about a hotel owner in Haiti whose employee had HIV. And just the way I told her, that's my favorite short story. But Edwidge Danticat gave an incredible keynote at the symposium that tied that mythology of Morrison's Tar Baby into the real life memorial called Lons Cafard. There's a memorial of what looks like ivory statues. And you see figures of ivory statues. It's on my blog. It's not in these photos, but if you click on the post on my IG before this 40th YouTube live post, you'll see the monument that we visited in this symposium visit. And it's a tribute to those Africans who died. It seemed the story of Lons Cafard, apostrophe ANSECAFFARD, is that around 1830, a wayward ship ended up in one of Martinique's bays and kept going around and around. And the ship looked like it capsized, and certain individuals were rescued, most were not. And those that did not survive were buried, the Africans that did not survive were buried literally under that monument, whereas those that did survive told, what they could, but it wasn't recorded. The captain of the ship, who is European, carrying Africans, was buried in the formal cemetery, whereas the Africans, so that even the way that the Martinicans tell the story of Lons Cafard just reminds you of the brutality of slavery and the colonial position of Africans vis-a-vis Europeans. So what Edwidge Danticat does in her keynote address is tie that history of Lons Cafard to the mythology of Morrison's horsemen. There's a story in Tar Baby of the horsemen and how they ended up being called the horsemen when they were brought to Morrison's Ile de Chevalier. So in Morrison's mythology, in her history in Tar Baby, she gives the history of this French colony that she creates called Ile de Chevalier. That's the English, no, that's the French version. In English, she's using the horsemen, which is what the people call those basically maroons. And so the main or the secondary character, Sun Green, is encouraged to not pursue JD, who, like many westernized people, have lost their ancient property. See, that's the crux of Tar Baby. And the crux of a season in the Congo is to beware of those who lost their ancient properties. I compare that kind of betrayal. And basically, the big advice in Tar Baby is what Sun gets from the servant character in Tar Baby, who is Therese. Therese works on basically the plantation of the Valerian Street. And Therese is the servant, Valerian servant, who tells Sun Green, stop chasing women, stop chasing men who have forgotten their ancient properties. They don't know who they've come from, they don't know where they've come from, and they don't care about why they've come from where. So that's the eternal moral. My father always wanted me to know the moral of what I was reading. And I will tell you straight up, the moral of Tar Baby is don't be around people who don't care about where they've come from. Be with people who care where they've come from. And so I tie that into Césaire's play, A Season in the Congo, in my paper, but I also tie it to another relationship in the latest book I wrote called To a More Positive Purpose. I compare the betrayal, Mobutu's betrayal of Césaire as Césaire, Mobutu's betrayal of Lumumba, written about by Césaire. I compare that to Bernard Court's betrayal of Maurice Bishop. So I deal with that in that paper. Thank you to Carolyn Denard and the Toni Morrison Society for enabling me to go to Martinique. Thanks to my grandmother, my sister, Denia. Thanks to Amir Savage. Thanks to Michael Bailey. Thanks to um, those individuals who really helped me to get to Martinique, because I had to maneuver. And I'm grateful I got what I needed, and it was worth it just to see the connections. Be proud of where you've come from, and seeing the Martinican people, I understand why Césaire wrote the way he did in the few 4 days I had there, about his people. He wrote passionately about his people, about pride. And ultimately, what you get in A Season in the Congo is the danger of betrayal, because we see what's happening in the Congo now, all because of that initial betrayal that Césaire wrote about in 1966. I was glad to meet his niece, Muriel Wiltor, and she was part of the Martinique tourism group that welcomed us beautifully. So shout out, congratulations. I tip my hat to the Toni Morrison Society, all those involved on making this an amazing experience for the members, to really tie that history of Morrison's writing to the writing of Aimé Césaire. Since I've done my last YouTube, um, Nathan Hare passed, and I just was interviewing today somebody who asked me about my teaching philosophy, and I had to bring up this man's name because Nathan Hare is so important to me. He was the chair. Hold on. Come on, behave, mama. Thank you. I don't know, for some reason my baby is getting anxious right now, and I just want to calm her down. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, a lot of people deal with anxiety in different ways, myself, my family, and even my babies. So since my last YouTube, yeah, I noticed the passing of Nathan Hare. I was very inspired by what he wrote. I was very inspired by what his wife, the late Dr. Julia Hare, said on Tavis Smiley's State of the Black Union. Um, there is a clip of her that seemed to have went viral, um, when she's talking about the lack of control Black parents seem to have over their children, and how, particularly in the West, it's very systemic. Um, and so there's a clip of Dr. Julia Hare talking about how the principals, basically superintendents, are scared of the children. And people respond very excitedly because they understand all too well, the lack of um, control the parents seem to have. And especially in this smartphone generation, the words of Dr. Julia Hare ring so true. But if I had to pick of everything Nathan Hare said, that really has stuck with me, that I try to live by in my work, in my teaching, in my publications, in my speeches, I have to come back to this article called Question and Answers About Black Studies. I was taught this article in my African American Studies course that I took in grad school when earning the PhD. We had to know who Nathan Hare was, what was he about, who were his teachers, who influenced him, and then I later found out Sonia Sanchez taught Black Studies at San Francisco State along with Amiri Baraka, and I ended up that her play was the one play I got the opportunity to direct and invite her to the reading. So it was a full circle moment discovering that. But I wanted to look at, in terms of writing, the most important thing for me that Nathan Hare, who passed, um, I believe he passed in the month of June, who passed what he taught me. Um, Nathan Hare here is asked, what would a sample curriculum or program of Black Studies look like? And the part that is so important that makes Black Studies different from every other discipline is what Nathan here spells out in this answer here about the pragmatic phase. The two phases of Black Studies we learned are expressive and pragmatic. Next month, I will be publishing an article published by Routledge, edited by Nazneen Khan and Marie Claude Jipweb Akhtar about CLR James's response to Black Studies. And CLR James was a professor at formerly Federal City, what is now University of District of Columbia. And he really broke down the theoretical focus of what Black Studies should be, questioning bourgeois history, questioning bourgeois scholarship, bourgeois meaning that ignores the working class, that ignores the perspective of whistleblowers, that ignores a more expansive history that you'll get through the discipline of Black Studies. So what Nathan Hare says about the pragmatic mission of Black Studies, looking at this second paragraph, the pragmatic phase operates specifically to prepare Black students to deal with their society. This is what makes Black Studies different from English. It's what makes it different from history, the Department of History all over the place. Um, my latest book is about Toni Martin. While he earned a PhD in history at Michigan State, his most impactful work, most important work was as a chair of Africana Studies, which, like as Nathan Hare is saying here about Black Studies, is helping those who read its practitioners' works. It helps, Black Studies helps those reading about it deal with their society. And that's really the thrust of my work as well. Nathan Hare says, the student's ultimate use of his pragmatic skills can be directed toward overcoming his or her, he's saying his, but in this context, his means his and hers. You have some very strong activists that want to write off Nathan Hare because he only talks about his, but the way his is being used, it is inclusive, it is not exclusive of hers. So when he writes his, he means his and hers. Hare writes that Black Studies teaches use of pragmatic skills that can be directed toward overcoming his or her handicaps in dealing with his society. The pragmatic phase in either case is highly functional. It has courses producing socioeconomic skills, Black politics, Black economics, Black science, Black communications, and so forth, dealing with uh, those aspects of the traditional disciplines that have to do with Black people. It includes extensive field work and community involvement in collaboration with classroom activities. It's not just the ivory tower. James Baldwin said when he was asked why he's not a professor, he did not want to be locked up under the whim of some ivory tower. All right. Please subscribe, like, and share my YouTube. This is my 40th YouTube Live. Glad to be back on after a few months. Had to settle myself in a new place, So I wanted to give you an example of traditional approach to study and the Black Studies approach to study, which is more inclusive through the life of Stokely Carmichael. On the left is the photo of his work in 61, his photo in 61 as a freedom writer. And then on the top right, you see a work that is in the Black Studies discipline. Stokely Carmichael with Ekwueme Michael Thelwell, who is a professor in Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst. And then below that is the book cover of what I consider a look at Stokely's life through a traditional perspective, through the traditional history perspective. And so this, just looking at his life, the way that writers, including Stokely himself, has written about his life really shows you the big and wide glaring difference between a traditional academic perspective and a Black Studies perspective. You really get a clear idea of the giant difference between a traditional academic perspective and a Black Studies perspective when you look at these two different books. Stokely, A Life is Absolutely written in the traditional academic perspective, and Ready for a Revolution is so important, regardless of how long it is. People are intimidated by its length. No, don't be, because the way it's written, it's not meant to alienate the reader. It's meant to bring the reader in to learn all the details about the life of this incredibly powerful cancer man, Kwame Ture. Okay. And the fact that the title of the book is Stokely already tells you the worldview of the writer. He chose to use his enslaved name rather than the name he gave himself. Kwame Ture named himself. And so I wrote a book review about a few years back, just reviewing the traditional academic history, and I compare it to a Black studies perspective, which you really get through Ekwueme's work. Ekwueme's work was mainly collaborative. Ekwueme, who I met a few years back, recorded Stokely Carmichael talking about his life. And again, the oral history you get is in a deeper way. You're knowing in a deeper way who Kwame Ture is, in a way that is much more accessible, truthful, detailed than the traditional academic history. So my point is real clear in this first paragraph when I wrote a review of Peniel Joseph's biography. I write that the 2014 biography by Peniel Joseph of Kwame Ture's life, entitled Stokely Alive, promotes what Ture calls disunity, disorganization, and ideological confusion, because it looks at Ture's life through a liberal imperialist lens that ultimately discouraged militant and revolutionary responses to capitalist exploitation. And so I go through and you can read this. If you contact me, I can email it to you directly if you're interested in reading the full copy of this. But it is an important example of the importance of a Black studies perspective to get a wider perspective other than the traditional academic perspective. And we're living in a world where we're going to need the latter more than the former. We're really going to need that Black studies perspective more and more as we face crises like the Gaza genocide. And we are asking the question of why all of a sudden everything that was put into Ukraine seems to have gotten for naught, because Ukraine has stopped the military aggression against Russia. So all that billions of dollars that the Biden administration poured into Russia looks like it was for nothing, because Russia is still maintaining its presence militarily in the region, as much as we gave the taxpayer money from this country to the nation of the Ukraine. So these are important questions. We're in a time when the Black studies perspective is becoming more and more important. So we thank Nathan Hare for showing us that that kind of curriculum and that kind of discipline can be taught in the American college, can in fact be supported and has a place, and is not simply a study of the first Negroes to do things. Ta-Nehisi Coates mentions the danger of teaching those kind of narratives to young people, particularly his son, when he said he did not want his son, he did not want his son's Black history to be simply a history of the first Blacks to do something, but rather an expansive history that includes efforts at reconciliation, efforts at forming a more harmonious interaction with different nations. The most important part of the review that I was able to complete was what I talk about, the big difference in Joseph and how he looks at Touré's response to Cuba. What I write is Joseph makes his fundamental difference in worldview clear to the reader when he calls Castro's 1953 attack on the Moncada barracks ill-fated. And as soon as I read that, I knew that was nowhere in what Ekwueme Michael Thelwell, in a Black Studies perspective, shared with us in his book on Kwame Ture's life. So again, that Black Studies perspective gives us a bigger, wider view of the world that we're going to need more and more now that it seems like the Democratic Party is in crisis and needs to let the world that it is more aware of the different movements and motions that are happening rather than being ignorant of them. Also, what was interesting that I had to point out was Peniel Joseph's take on who Garvey is. I write that Peniel Joseph disparages the Garvey movement when he writes, Carmichael's promise that a return to Africa remains the ultimate goal, expressed more of a personal desire than a collective sentiment. And when you look at the history, it wasn't a personal desire of Kwame Ture's, because he actually went back to he actually went back to Africa. So he actually carried out what Garvey instead was promoting. Um, so that is what I wanted to point out about the major difference in a traditional academic perspective and a Black studies perspective that we need to get more of. Um, I wanted to look at, right, okay. So finally, I just wanted to lift up my awesome cousin, congratulating her. This is an important time in her life. Her name is Lanique, and she gave everybody who visited her wedding a flower, and the flower says Julian and Lanique Jarvis. She's now Mrs. Jarvis, and their wedding was on June 27, 2024. So right after going to Martinique, I had the pleasure to attend her wedding that was in Canada. Her family visited my family when I was in grade school, and my family visited her family before I was in grade school. So I'm just grateful to see her take that next step, take that next step of marriage. And it's really an important example for me personally about what could, you know, what could be possible. So I'm grateful for the example that she was able to provide about her and my other cousins on being able to get married. So so much happened, since we last spoke here. I was able to attend my cousin's wedding, the passing of Nathan Hare, my presentation on Aimé Césaire and the work of Toni Morrison. Again, please like, share, and subscribe. Well, I'm not at the subscription point yet. I will be. I'm planning to organize a Patreon. However, you can absolutely, if this blessed you, bless my Cash App, which is $ Rhone Fraser. That's RHONEFRASER. And check out my latest book. My latest book is entitled To a More Positive Purpose, Critical Responses to the Scholarship of Toni Martin. Just like the way I promote Toni Morrison, it is my belief that when we study the history of Toni Martin, whose transition in 2013, and engage that, being aware of the traditional academic perspective as opposed to the Black studies perspective, we'll see the world open up much wider. All right. Thank you for watching. Please keep reading and keep the faith.